Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. As always, I am excited as I could possibly be to introduce our guest to you. But before I do, there are a few people I want to thank that we always thank. We want to thank brassandwinds.com. The Mighty Quinn Brass and Winds is a fantastic place to purchase brass or woodwind instruments, and when we need them for the Willow here at the Willow School, we use them. Try them out, brassandwinds.com. You're watching Truer MU. Welcome to my musical mind. We try to make sure you get a good experience with every video and ask questions we think you might not have thought to ask. And that being said, I'd like to introduce our guest to you today. First, a story, as there often is. This is another one of my Oberlin friends that is a guest. And here's the story of how I met him. I believe I was a junior in college at that point, and I was walking along campus, and sitting in the grass was this guitar player just jamming like crazy, playing just like there was an audience of 50,000 people in front of him. And I said, wow, I want to work with this guy. So I introduced myself, and we got together once, and we played together a little bit, but it didn't really click so much. We just kind of went our separate ways. But then I asked him to help me with a song. If you're familiar with my album, The End of the Beginning, there's a song called Traffic. Brent Stansfield, my guest, helped me with the first version of that song and did a great job. I liked what he did so much that I incorporated his stuff into the final version. Let me tell you a little bit about Brent Stansfield. He is the director of graduate medical education at Wayne State University. He holds a PhD in experimental psychology from the University of California, Berkeley, and he is an accomplished musician and songwriter as well. Brent, I haven't seen you in 30 some years. It's great to see you.
It's been a long time. It is so good to see you.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
for
you for
inviting
coming
me to
on.
do this. This
It
is
is
wonderful.
my pleasure. And of course, I wanted you on because we've worked together on something called Song Fight, which we're going to talk about later. And
Okay.
so we've gotten together and reacquainted ourselves some years ago. But in preparing for this interview, I learned a lot about you. And I like to, it's called The Truth About Music, but I like to interview people who are not necessarily all musician because interesting things come about that are related to music. And in your case, I found lots. First, I want to talk about your history in two places. You are two things. You are a musician and a songwriter, and you are also a psychologist and educator. And I want to talk about your history through both. So I want to go through your life and talk about how those two things came about, and maybe they came about in parallel, maybe they came about, serially. Let's find out. I know that you spent your early years in a little town called Woodbury, Connecticut.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to tell you about it because you don't know anything about Woodbury. It's a very picturesque little town, very conservative. It's remained small, under 10,000 people. It's about 2 hours from NYC, so it's both bucolic and right close to the big city. And some interesting folks came out of there. Leroy Anderson, the author of Sleigh Ride, that was from there.
I raked
Joe
his
Beck,
lawn.
yeah, Joe Beck, jazz guitar, and Rob Zombie lived there for a while. So an interesting little town.
Yeah,
Tell us
yeah.
about it.
Well, also Marilyn Monroe lived there when she was
Wow.
married to Arthur Miller.
Wow.
Lived there, pretty close to where my house was. Um, yeah, it's a gorgeous little town. New England is a fun place to grow up, and Connecticut is the warmest spot in New England, so I highly recommend it
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you're going to go to that region of the country. Yeah, and like you said, it was small, it was conservative. There wasn't a lot of real music going on there, like interesting stuff. Like I didn't really discover music until I went to high school.
Oh,
I did a
wow.
couple things. My first big performance actually was when I was very young. I was recruited to be in Amal and the Night Visitors, which is an operetta by
Minotti.
John Menotti,
Yeah.
exactly. And I played Amal. I was
Oh,
in, I
wow.
think, fourth grade at the time. I was very young. And I don't know how they got. I think my music teacher in elementary school said like, "Well, here's a kid who seems to know he can hold a
What he's
tune.
doing.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
has an ear at least." I was way over my head with the Connecticut Choral Society, but that was a fun performance. And that was
Yeah.
kind of where I sort of got the taste of what it is to be on stage in front of an audience. And I
Sure.
haven't really stopped loving that feeling.
Yeah.
Um,
So did you perform a lot in your small town?
Not a lot. I did a couple things in middle school, through the school. I was in a church choir. I did a couple of performances at church, like wherever you could. But when you're a kid, I don't know, you don't have a lot of opportunities unless you have like parents who are willing to do a lot of work for you, clear a lot of way.
Right.
Um,
So I
but I
take it your
took, you know, I
parents
took,
were interested but kind of benign and just let you do your thing.
yeah, my dad is a musician. He's of sorts. He's a guitar player. He was in a band when he was in college, and he remembers that the fun of that. And so he bought me my first guitar, and I had started taking guitar lessons when I was in second grade,
Oh
stuff like
wow.
that.
Okay.
And obviously, they were supportive enough to drive me to, rehearsals for this and that. But
Mm. Did you
you
get into
know,
the city at all?
few, going into the city was I was always intimidated by it. And in the 80s, it was a different experience. It's
Yeah.
easier now, I think, in a lot of ways.
It was a pretty
Transportation's
scary
bad
city in
there.
the 80s, really.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was pretty dark, but we did manage to get in. I remember seeing Little Shop of Horrors off Broadway when it was in this
Nice.
like little hole in the ground, a hole in the wall, I should say. And every once in a while you go in for your birthday or something and do something, but it was always like get in and get out. And
Hmm.
um, I wish I had had the city chops to get in there and just kind of see stuff. I had friends who would sneak in. I remember one guy who used to go to the knitting factory all the time. Um, and and he saw everybody. He saw John Zorn and
Oh wow.
Amy Denio, and although they might be giants when they were just like
Yeah.
two guys in an accordion.
Right.
But I missed out on that stuff. I'm not street smart enough.
You play guitar. When you were at Oberlin, you played guitar better than the average person who just takes lessons. You really had a lot of stage charisma. You were really, wow, you had a real powerful presence. Uh, is that just your personality, or did you develop that in Connecticut?
No, that's all skill. I mean, it's practice, and like I said, like it's the stage stuff. It's sort of distinct from music is performance,
Mm.
and it's interesting. There's a I don't know where you're going with this, but if we start talking about music psychology,
Well, we're
there's a
going there.
really
Yeah.
there's a really good study by, if I'm remembering the name correctly, a researcher named Tree Hub is her last name. And she did a study where she videotaped performers, piano performers, and then she would play just the sound, just the video, or both to viewers and ask them to rate the emotionality of the music. And the people who saw it, even without the music, they would be like, they could nail the expression. Oh, this is a sad piece. This one's incredibly cheerful. Like there's something about being on stage and performing that's the physical act that's
Hmm.
above and beyond the actual performance in the the instrument. And I think anybody who's been to a punk show knows that you know you don't have to be a virtuoso to entertain a crowd, and a lot of the being on stage is its own sort of art.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's use this as a bit of a segue. Clearly, you had thought about this to some extent, even at that young age. So, when did you become a psychologist?
Oh, well, when you met me, that was when I was undergoing the transition. It was very much a thing, and this is my daughters are now going to college, and so I try to impress on them uh, this. And so, if any of your listeners are in this stage of their life, which is probably your whole life, which is what happened to me, was a teacher, a professor in the psychology department, just came up to me in the hallway and said, "I need help on a thing. Can you help me?" And I said, "Yes." And that was it. That was it. And then I was hooked on psychology. The thing he needed
Wow.
help with, he was a cognitive psychologist, and he asked me this question. He was like, "You take music history classes," which I did. And he said, "I hear that they do these things called needle drop tests, where you've learned about a genre, you've learned about the history of music, and part of the test is, the professor just comes up in front of the class and just puts a record on, if people know what a record is, and they put the needle down some random place in the middle of the piece and just let it play for 20 seconds, pick up the needle and then say, okay, go, tell me, like, when was it written, by whom, for whom, for which players, who's playing it, what's the context in which it was played, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And this psychology professor was asking me, like, well, what goes on in your head when you take that test? Like, what does it feel like to hear something you've never heard before, but to know what it is? Like,
Hmm.
what is it? What do you picking up? What do you listen for? And he was just kind of peppering me with those questions. And the more I talked to him, the more it became apparent that he was asking questions that I was asking myself all the time, which is, what is music? Why do we do it? Um, there was, oh, and you know what? I forgot to mention, in Woodbury, Connecticut, in the public library, I did find a set of lectures by Leonard Bernstein called The
Uh-huh.
Unanswered Question.
Oh, those
Which,
are
oh
fantastic.
man. And he goes on about this stuff for hours, just
Yes,
talking
yes.
about what does it mean for a minor chord that's structured this way to resolve this way. Doesn't it seem, it seems to ask a question, and here's why, because from a music theory standpoint, you're moving into this ambiguous space. You're starting where you know where you are, and then you're doing a thing that suddenly you don't know where you are. And isn't that how you ask a question with music? And here's a set of pieces that all do that.
Mhm.
And and all every question gets answered by
So
a
you
it,
watched these as a teenager?
it was I was in middle school, I think, when I discovered
Ah,
those.
wow.
And it was
So,
just audio. It was just like a set of
oh,
cassette
interesting.
tapes, if I remember correctly.
So these are now available. If these are the same ones, the Harvard lectures,
Yep.
there's 6 of them. They range from an hour and a half to 3 hours long each. They
Yep.
are mind blowing, and they're
They
all
are
available on
amazing.
YouTube. Anyone can go on YouTube and search them out now, and I recommend they do. But I mean, I first caught these as a mature adult, and I
Yeah.
still couldn't stay awake for the first one because my mind was just overloaded with all the concepts. I was just like,
I
oh.
know
And
it
you caught this
hummed
as a
with
middle schooler.
energy.
I can't even believe it.
Yeah. I had a great aunt who loved Leonard Bernstein, called him Lenny, sort of considered him her unofficial boyfriend. And I don't know where that came from. She just loved him. And she would play. She played a lot of classical music around the house. Her little flat in New Haven, we would
Yeah.
go visit. Um, and so I kind of picked up the bug there. And I'd been interested in classical music for a long time. I remember getting the Yellow Submarine album by the Beatles, because the
Right.
B side of that album is all of George Martin's orchestral score for the movie, which has all these quotes, which I didn't get. But when I went to college, I was like, oh my God, that's a Bartok quote. Like, I know that piece. I've heard that before. And I'm like,
Wow.
oh, they quote that in the
That's great. I
Pepperland
haven't listened to
March.
those in so long. I might have to re-listen to that.
Yeah, go check them out. There's Stravinsky
Bartok.
in there, and there's Bartok in there, because George Martin knew what he was doing.
Of course, you're right. He was a classical producer before he was with the Beatles.
Right.
Yeah.
And a comedy producer.
That's true. That's true. So Oberlin because of music or
Yeah. So my original goal, I went to Oberlin thinking I'm going to study composition and learn how to write music for film.
but you weren't in the conservatory when you got there, were you? Or were you?
No, I didn't even apply. I went to the college, and then I was thinking, I'll
Slip
minor
in
in
the side
music, or
door?
I'll
Oh,
just take a
minor.
bunch of classes. And then my goal was to write music for film, so I thought I could take a lot of English, or maybe some. I mean, computer science wasn't really a thing at the time, but I was interested in sort of the technical aspects of recording,
Okay.
uh, and thought I could sort of leverage the liberal arts angle into a thing like that. But
At
psychology,
Oberlin you could. I did.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's the power of a liberal arts education too, is it really gives you a lot of opportunity to branch out. Um, and if I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have gone in with career plans, because you get shaken up by the things you don't know you're going to learn, and then
Right.
something
Right.
else happens to you.
Well, now, so there's this dark period in between your PhD in Oberlin where you were in Columbus and Park City, Utah, and I'd
Yep,
like to
yep.
know what you did.
I was a bum. I was awesome. It was a great time. I took a couple of years off after college. Um, and yeah, I lived in Park City, Utah. I learned how to fly a hot air balloon.
Wow.
I worked at the
Next
balloon
interview.
company. Yeah, I mean, and I went for my pilot's license, but I didn't log enough hours to actually like follow through on it.
Wow.
But I was the guy who drove the van and poured the champagne and stuff like that. But then they
Yeah.
let me fly the balloon on off days, and
Oh my gosh.
that was fun. I worked at I worked at Park City, or Deer Valley, I should say, the ski place. I just worked. I was like a cashier at the restaurant, and then I would ski on my off days. But that was fun, and I did a lot of personal recording, like just little 4-track recording.
Yeah.
At the time, and I do have a collection of songs from that period, which are quite depressing, actually. Now that if I re-listen to them, I'm like, what was I going through then? Because in my head, it was a very cheerful time of my life. But
Huh. Well, that's really interesting. So, was this a hiatus where you knew you were headed back to psychology, or were you in this kind of what should I do phase?
Yeah, it was an exploratory find yourself phase, and my goal was to see how long I could live away from school and academics.
Hmm.
Um, and the answer was a year.
Oh, just one
And then
year.
I was ready to go. So
Wow.
I applied for a job in Columbus at the Ohio State University in a music psychology lab with someone who I had gone to her lecture actually when I was at Oberlin, and went up afterwards and asked a bunch of questions. And then that turned into an unpaid summer internship when I was in college, which then turned into this job, which was sort of my first real job. And I worked in a music psychology lab. Carolyn Palmer,
Hmm.
um, and she studied at the time. She was interested in how kids learn how to play the piano,
Yeah.
and she had all these like MIDI recordings of kids making terrible mistakes, and that was fun because you got to memorize those. And when one started up, you're like, "Oh man, here it comes! Oh, I don't like this one." But we'd play those on loops, and we did a lot of analysis of MIDI files and
Yeah.
looking at the exact timing that when a kid makes a mistake, how long do they wait before they fix it and go back? Um, and at what age do they discover the thing where it's better to keep going than it is to like stop and be like, wait, that wasn't right. I'm gonna, they
Were
realize
you,
they're not typing something, they're performing something.
were you answering questions for yourself that were beyond the research, or were you just, I just love doing this?
Well, there were two things going on at that time. One was the actual content of the stuff, which I just thought was fascinating. And yes, I was doing a lot of reading, and I was doing all the things that the grad students were doing about, you know, going to journal club and asking weird research questions. And I didn't get to go so far as to design or run any of my own experiments because that wasn't my role.
Yeah.
Um, but I was right there. I was helping them. If they needed an experiment run, I was there
Yeah.
helping them implement it. And I was really curious, doing data analysis and making graphs and stuff like that. And the other one was I was learning how to use computers because that was an interesting lab. They had two Sun Spark stations that were running BSD Unix. They were like mounted on each other. I don't know why, but it was the very beginning of the internet too. So um, I knew I was basically the sysadmin for this little lab on these two Unix machines.
Uh huh.
And, we'd set it up so that people could log in remotely. I remember one grad student friend of mine lived in North Dakota, and she would log in and we'd, chat demon each other,
Yeah.
which you
Yeah.
remember doing when we were at Oberlin. We could do that stuff. But
Well, to tell
suddenly,
you the truth, I didn't do that at Oberlin because I discovered BBSing in high school. So
yeah, yeah.
I was doing that before I got to Oberlin, and everybody was so excited about the vax, and I said, "Yeah, I did
Yeah, I've
that."
done that.
Internet, we know. Yeah. Well, so what happens here? Critical mass takes over, and you just get pulled into Berkeley, or what's?
No, when I was there, I applied to graduate school. I applied to OSU. I applied to Berkeley in part because there was a researcher there who does auditory work named Irv Hafter, who was absolutely brilliant, um, and did a lot of interesting psychophysics stuff. And then it was McGill was the other place I applied because there's a guy named Bregman, I believe, who similarly was interested in audition and how the ear
Mhm.
like pulls patterns out of the soundscape that we encounter. But I got into Berkeley, and I was like, well, I'm going to Berkeley. And then Carolyn Palmer, of course, had no idea like why I would have the guts to just tell her to her face, like, she was like, what are you doing? Like, I literally have been mentoring you. That I was too clueless. I was like, Berkeley sounds nice. I'm going there.
So she
So
wanted you to stay.
yeah, I think it was the assumption that
Oh,
I would stay and work in her lab. I regret that. I regret that. It would have been really good if I had stayed too. But that said, I loved Berkeley, and I ended up switching out of Hafter's lab into the lab of a guy named Rich Ivory, who is interested in patterns and motor control and perception. And so I started to study rhythm and basically how the nervous system encapsulates rhythms, how you represent rhythms in your mind when you perform rhythms, like how do you do the chunking, because it's very much you know a sequence thing. Like I know this pattern and I know that pattern, so I do A and then I do B and then I do A and then I do B, and you can see that in the timing if you do sort of a millisecond timing of people drumming. We'd get like kids doing drum corps would come in and do these like tapping exercises, and we would just measure the time between their taps down to the millisecond and look for patterns.
Wow.
And he had it down where he could actually, Dr. Ivory had this down an interesting method of inferring how much timing error is in the musculature between your brain and your finger, and how much is actually due to like mistiming that your brain is doing, because nothing's perfect.
Right.
It's fascinating stuff. So
Yeah, your PhD, how the brain learns and controls skilled behavior that requires precise timing. Music is not in that sentence, but that basically refers to music.
right, and music performance. And I was interested in my actual dissertation work was about um, how rhythm distorts your perception of time. So if a rhythm
Ah,
speeds up, your sense of time goes with it, and then the same, a second seems a little longer if you've entrained yourself to a faster rhythm, and it
oh,
seems a
please
little
say more about this.
slower.
This is fascinating. What do you mean?
Okay, well, you know that illusion, like that visual illusion where you have two lines and they're the same length, but there's
Yeah.
these two like angled lines around them, and you're like, oh,
Right.
the top one's definitely bigger. And then when you take those lines away, you're like, oh no, they're the same size. Well, the
Yeah.
same thing happens with time, right? Like if I played you, if I, that's 400 milliseconds and that's 400 milliseconds. But if I gave you bop bop and then I gave you a rhythm that was da 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 bop 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 bop, and then I gave you the 400 milliseconds again, you'd be like, nope, that second one was longer. And so I
Ah,
was able actually to quantify that and show that that illusion actually holds under different conditions, and the rhythms have to have certain parameters in order to actually make that effect work. And then it's not just the fact that the faster rhythm has shorter intervals towards the end. You actually have to like drag somebody along,
wow.
sort of bring all their little oscillators up to speed, and that's what makes time slow down.
You're codifying an aesthetic experience. That's fascinating.
I know, it was fascinating. I wish I still did that stuff. I didn't. I sadly, there's not a lot of work um, for music psychologists.
Right.
And I probably see, and I bet if I'd stayed in Carolyn's lab too, she would have bent over backwards to get me into the.
Well, you could come crawling back.
I could, we've made peace. I've talked to her many times, and I'm very happy with my, she's been an amazing mentor.
Yeah. Well, did all of this change? Were you still performing while you were in grad school? Did all this change anything for you?
I did very little performing in graduate school. I'm trying to I don't think I did anything. I sort of gave up performing in general. We did have what we used to call performance parties, where anybody could come to the party, but they had to do 5 minutes. And so we would just have to have a stage set up, and that was your entry fee.
Okay.
And people would come and be totally nervous and just be like, can I please just not do it? And after, you know, X number of beers and X number of other people performing, like you couldn't get most people off stage. Like once they realize like, oh, you can get up and do anything, and people like will hoot and holler and they'll love you. Like
Then they're
it's a
in.
drug. You get excited about it. You want to do
Yes.
more of it.
Well,